The scream came first, sharp and sudden, cutting through the music of the grand ballroom before anyone understood why. Eleanor Whitmore felt every eye in the room turn toward her at once. She had been standing near the tall windows, holding a glass of lemonade, when a woman's voice rose above the orchestra and shattered the polite hum of conversation. She was seen leaving his chambers at midnight. I saw it with my own eyes. The voice belonged to Constance Fairweather, a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions. She stood in the center of the ballroom now, pointing directly at Eleanor, her face twisted into a mask of false concern that fooled no one who looked closely, yet convinced almost everyone who did not. Eleanor's hand trembled. The glass nearly slipped from her fingers. "That is not true," she said, but her voice came out too quiet, swallowed by the sudden silence pressing in from every direction. 200 pairs of eyes had turned to stare, and in that instant Eleanor understood something terrible. It did not matter what was true. It only mattered what people believed. Whispers began, quick as fire catching dry grass. I heard her own maid speak of it. "Poor girl, she will never marry now. Her father will be ruined within the week." Eleanor stood frozen, her cheeks burning, her heart pounding so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She searched the crowd for her mother and found her near the refreshment table, face pale, hand pressed to her chest. Her father stood beside her mother, his jaw tight, his eyes darting nervously as if searching for an escape that did not exist. Eleanor had done nothing wrong. She had spent the previous evening at home, reading by candlelight while her mother mended a torn hem beside her. There had been no midnight visit, no secret meeting, nothing but an ordinary night in an ordinary house. Yet none of that mattered now. A lie, once spoken aloud in a crowded room, spread faster than any truth ever could. "I demand you take that back," Eleanor said, forcing steel into her voice this time, though her knees felt weak beneath her skirts. Constance only smiled, cool and satisfied. "I only repeat what I heard, Miss Whitmore. If it troubles you so greatly, perhaps it is because there is truth in it." Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd, cruel and quiet. Eleanor felt tears threaten behind her eyes, and she despised herself for it. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of people who wanted nothing more than to watch her fall apart for their entertainment. She did not notice the tall figure moving through the crowd until he was already beside her. Sebastian Ashford, the Duke of Havenwood, had watched the entire scene unfold from across the room, and something in him had gone cold and still the moment he understood what was happening. He knew Constance Fairweather. He knew her reputation for manufacturing scandal to elevate her own standing, and he had long suspected she resented any woman who drew attention away from herself. He had never spoken more than a few polite words to Eleanor Whitmore in his life, yet watching her stand alone against an entire ballroom of cruelty stirred something fierce and immediate in his chest. He was a man known throughout society for his composure. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely acted without careful thought. But as he crossed the ballroom floor, every step deliberate, he felt none of his usual restraint. He felt only a burning need to stop the injustice happening in front of him before it destroyed a young woman who had done nothing to deserve it. Eleanor did not see him coming until he was directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the intensity in his dark eyes. "Forgive me," he said, his voice low but carrying easily across the suddenly hushed room. Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, before she could even draw a full breath, the Duke of Havenwood leaned down and kissed her. The ballroom fell utterly silent. Even the orchestra faltered, the final notes trailing off into nothing. 200 guests stood frozen, staring at a sight none of them had ever expected to witness. The Duke of Havenwood, the most eligible and most guarded bachelor in the entire county, had just kissed Eleanor Whitmore in front of the whole of society. Eleanor's mind went blank with shock. His lips were warm and steady against hers, and for one dizzying moment, the noise of the room, the whispers, the cruel laughter, all of it disappeared entirely. She was aware only of the sudden and overwhelming presence of him, the faint scent of cedar and rain, the warmth of his hand where it had come to rest gently at her elbow. Then he pulled back, and reality crashed down around her again. The room remained silent, but the nature of the silence had shifted entirely. No one was laughing now. No one was whispering cruel jokes. Instead, the guests stared with open astonishment, whispering questions instead of accusations. The Duke kissed her. Truly. Surely he would not do such a thing unless there was an understanding between them. No man of his standing would risk his own reputation for a woman unless he meant something by it. Elinor stared up at Sebastian, stunned, her lips still warm from his, her heart racing for an entirely different reason now. She saw something steady and unshaken in his expression, though she also saw, just beneath the surface, the faintest flicker of uncertainty, as though even he was surprised by what he had just done. "What have you done?" she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "I have given them something else to talk about," he answered simply. Across the room, Constance Fairweather's triumphant expression had crumbled into something far less confident. Whatever story she had hoped to spread now seemed impossible. No duke, especially not one as careful and dignified as Sebastian Ashford, would kiss a woman of poor reputation in front of the entire ton. His action had, in a single moment, rewritten the story the room believed. But Elinor felt no relief. She felt only a rising panic, hot and sharp beneath her ribs. "You have made things worse," she said, stepping back from him, her voice trembling now with anger rather than gratitude. "Do you understand what you have done? Now they will believe there is an understanding between us. Now every eye in this room will watch me, waiting to see what happens next." "I understand," Sebastian said quietly. "And I take full responsibility for it." "Responsibility does not undo scandal, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, "but it can shape it." Elinor did not have the chance to respond. Her mother appeared at her side, gripping her arm tightly, her face a mixture of horror and desperate calculation. "Elinor, come with me at once," her mother said, casting nervous glances at the surrounding guests, all of whom were still watching with undisguised fascination. Her father approached from the other direction, his expression unreadable, though Elinor noticed the way his eyes lingered on the Duke with something close to cautious hope. Sebastian bowed slightly, his composure returning, though Elinor could see the tension still held in his shoulders. "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, I would like to call upon your household tomorrow, if you would permit it." Elinor's mother's eyes widened. "Of course, Your Grace, of course you may call." "Mother," Elinor said sharply, but her mother was already steering her away, whispering urgently about propriety and appearances, about how this could be salvaged, about how everything might yet turn out well. Elinor glanced back once as she was led from the ballroom. Sebastian stood exactly where she had left him, watching her go, his expression unreadable in the golden candlelight. Around him, the guests had already begun murmuring again, but the tone had changed entirely from cruelty to speculation, from mockery to curiosity. She did not know whether to feel grateful or furious. Perhaps, she thought as she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt both at once, tangled together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. The carriage ride home passed in near silence. Her mother wrung her hands and spoke in hushed, excited tones about the possibility of a ducal match, while her father stared out the window, deep in thought. Elinor sat between them, her fingers still pressed lightly to her lips, replaying the moment again and again in her mind. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ballroom, heard the gasps, felt the warmth of his hand at her elbow and the press of his mouth against hers. She had gone to the ball expecting an evening of quiet conversation and polite dancing. She had not expected her reputation to be shattered and rebuilt within the span of a single hour, nor had she expected the man responsible for both to be a duke she barely knew. By morning, all of London seemed to already know what had happened. A servant girl brought news from the market that the story had spread through every household before the sun had fully risen. Elinor sat at the breakfast table, pushing food around her plate, unable to eat, while her mother read aloud from a note that had arrived only an hour earlier. "He says he will call this afternoon," her mother said, practically glowing with excitement. "Oh, Elinor, do you understand what this could mean for our family?" Elinor understood entirely too well. A duke's public gesture, however unexpected, however unplanned, would now be interpreted by all of society as a declaration of intent. She had not asked for his help. She had not wanted to be rescued in such a public and irreversible way. Yet now, whether she wished it or not, her fate had become tangled with a man she barely knew, a man whose motives she could not yet fully understand. She thought of the steadiness in his eyes as he had approached her through the crowd, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said he understood what he had done. There had been no arrogance in his expression, no sense that he considered himself clever or heroic. He had simply acted, swiftly and without hesitation, to stop an injustice he could not bear to watch unfold. Perhaps that should have comforted her. Instead, it left her with more questions than before. What kind of man risked his own reputation so completely for a woman he barely knew? What did he truly want from her, if not simply to end a cruel rumor? Elinor rose from the table and walked to the window, watching the street below, where carriages rolled past carrying the very people who had witnessed her humiliation and her sudden, startling rescue the night before. Somewhere out there, the Duke of Havenwood was likely preparing to call on her family, to explain himself, to decide what came next for both of them. Whatever happened this afternoon, Elinor understood one thing with absolute clarity. Her life, which only yesterday had felt quiet and predictable, had changed irrevocably in the span of a single kiss. And she had no idea, not yet, whether that change would prove to be her ruin or her rescue. Sebastian Ashford stood in his study long after the ball had ended, staring into the dying fire, replaying the moment again and again in his mind. He had never in his life acted so rashly, so completely without calculation. He was a man who weighed every decision carefully, who had been raised from boyhood to understand that a duke's actions carried consequences far beyond himself. Yet in that single moment, watching Elinor Whitmore stand alone against the cruelty of an entire ballroom, all his careful restraint had simply vanished. He rubbed a hand across his face and exhaled slowly. What he had done could not be undone. By morning, the story would have spread through every drawing room in London, growing more elaborate with each retelling. There would be no quiet way to explain it, no simple correction that would satisfy the endless appetite of society for gossip. He had kissed a woman he barely knew, in front of hundreds of witnesses, and in doing so, he had bound her fate to his own, whether either of them wished it or not. His valet, Harris, entered quietly to bank the fire for the night, pausing when he noticed the Duke still awake at such a late hour. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Sebastian shook his head. "No, thank you, Harris." The older man hesitated at the door. He had served the Ashford family for over 20 years and had rarely seen the Duke so unsettled. "If I may say so, Your Grace, the household has already heard talk of the evening. The story travels quickly." "I imagine it does," Sebastian said quietly. Harris nodded and withdrew, leaving Sebastian alone once more with his thoughts. He thought of his father, a man who had ruled Havenwood with an iron sense of duty and almost no warmth at all. His father had taught him that a duke's first responsibility was to his name, his estate, and his tenants, and that personal feeling must always come second to obligation. Sebastian had spent his entire adult life following that lesson faithfully, keeping his emotions carefully guarded, choosing every action with deliberate control. Tonight, for the first time he could remember, he had acted purely on instinct, and the instinct had not been calculated ambition or careful strategy. It had been something far simpler and far more unsettling. He had not been able to bear watching an innocent woman destroyed by a lie, and he had acted before he had even fully decided to. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the dark gardens below. Whatever his reasons, the outcome remained the same. Elinor Whitmore's reputation, and quite possibly her entire future, now depended on what he did next. He would not allow her to suffer further because of his impulsive choice. Whatever it cost him, he intended to make things right. By the time morning arrived, Sebastian had already decided what he must do, though the decision brought him no particular comfort. He dressed carefully, more carefully than usual, and ordered his carriage prepared for the early afternoon. He intended to call upon the Whitmore family and address the matter directly, as honor demanded. The ride to the Whitmore household took longer than he expected, winding through streets already alive with the low hum of gossip. He caught snatches of conversation as his carriage passed groups of pedestrians, all discussing the same subject with varying degrees of scandal and delight. He kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he felt the weight of every whispered word. When he arrived, he was shown into a modest but well-kept drawing room, where Aliner's parents waited with barely concealed anxiety. Mrs. Whitmore rose immediately, curtsying so deeply Sebastian felt a flicker of discomfort at the deference. "Your Grace, thank you for coming. Please sit." Mr. Whitmore offered a more measured greeting, though Sebastian noticed the same nervous energy beneath his composed exterior. It was clear the family understood exactly what a visit from a duke, following such a public display the night before, was likely to mean. Aliner entered a few moments later, and Sebastian rose immediately from his seat. She looked pale, her eyes shadowed as though she had slept little, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that struck him more than any of the polished manners he had witnessed the night before at the ball. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Miss Whitmore." An awkward silence settled over the room. Mrs. Whitmore, unable to bear it, finally spoke. "Perhaps, Your Grace, you and Aliner might speak privately for a moment. My husband and I will only be in the next room." Aliner looked as though she wanted to object, but her mother had already ushered her father toward the door, leaving Sebastian and Aliner alone in the drawing room, the morning light falling in soft patterns across the worn but tidy furniture. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I owe you an apology," Sebastian said finally. Aliner's eyebrows rose slightly. "An apology, Your Grace? For what precisely? For humiliating me further, or for making certain the entire city now believes there is an understanding between us that does not exist?" Her words carried a sharp edge, and Sebastian found he did not blame her for it. "For acting without considering the consequences to you," he said. "I saw an injustice and I acted to stop it. I did not think beyond that moment. I should have." Aliner studied him carefully, as though trying to determine whether his words were sincere or merely practiced. "And what do you intend to do now, Your Grace? Now that the entire ton believes we are all but engaged?" Sebastian met her gaze directly. "I intend to marry you, Miss Whitmore, if you will have me." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had expected. Aliner's lips parted in surprise, and for a moment she said nothing at all. "You cannot possibly mean that," she said finally. "We scarcely know one another. You danced with me once, months ago, and exchanged perhaps a dozen words with me before last night. Marriage is not a solution to a scandal, Your Grace. It is a lifetime commitment." "I am aware of what marriage entails," he said quietly. "I do not offer it lightly, nor do I offer it merely to satisfy society's expectations. I offer it because my actions last night placed you in an impossible position, and I will not allow you to bear the consequences of my choice alone." Aliner turned away from him, walking toward the window, her arms wrapped around herself as though holding herself together by will alone. "You speak of honor and duty, Your Grace, but what of my own wishes? Have you considered that I might not wish to marry a man I do not love, simply because society demands it?" "I have considered it," Sebastian said, "and I would not force such a fate upon you. If you refuse, I will find another way to protect your reputation. I will make it known publicly that my actions were entirely my own, that you bear no responsibility for what occurred, and that any assumption of an understanding between us was mistaken." Aliner turned back to face him, studying his expression carefully. She saw no trace of deception in his face, no calculated attempt to manipulate her into agreement. He appeared, if anything, genuinely uncomfortable with the entire situation, a man forcing himself through an obligation he felt bound to fulfill regardless of personal cost. "And if I refuse your proposal," she said slowly, "what becomes of your own reputation, Your Grace? Surely a duke publicly declaring that his actions meant nothing would invite its own scandal. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly. That is not your concern. It is entirely my concern, Elinor said. If the alternative to marrying you is watching you suffer for an act you undertook to protect me. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling heavily over the room. Elinor thought of her family, of the modest income that barely sustained their household, of the whispers that would follow her for years if she remained unmarried after such a public scandal. She thought of her younger sister, still unmarried herself, whose own prospects would suffer terribly if the Whitmore name became permanently tainted by gossip. She thought, too, of the steadiness in Sebastian's eyes, the sincerity in his voice when he spoke of honor and responsibility. Whatever else was true, she did not believe he was a cruel man, nor a man who acted purely from selfish motive. If I agree, she said finally, I want it understood clearly between us. I will not pretend to feelings I do not have, Your Grace. This will be a marriage of practicality, nothing more. I ask only for honesty and respect in return. Sebastian inclined his head. You shall have both, I promise you. Elinor exhaled slowly, feeling as though she had just stepped off a precipice into uncertain air. Then I accept your proposal. Relief and something else, something she could not quite name, passed briefly across Sebastian's expression before his composure returned. Thank you, he said quietly. I will speak with your father at once and make the necessary arrangements. As he moved toward the door, Elinor spoke once more, her voice quieter now, less guarded than before. Your Grace. He paused, turning back to face her. Why did you truly do it? She asked. Last night, I mean, you could have simply spoken in my defense. You did not need to kiss me in front of the entire ballroom. Sebastian considered the question carefully before answering. I am not entirely certain, he admitted. I saw you standing alone, facing an entire room determined to believe the worst of you, and something in me refused to allow it to continue. Perhaps I acted without full reason. I have never before allowed myself to act so far outside careful judgment. Elinor studied him for a long moment, searching for insincerity and finding none. That is either the most reckless thing I have ever heard, she said, or the most honest. Perhaps it was both, Sebastian said, and for the first time since they had met, the faintest hint of a smile touched his expression. He left shortly after to speak with her father, and Elinor remained alone in the drawing room, staring out at the street where her future had just been irrevocably altered. She did not know yet what kind of marriage awaited her, whether it would bring genuine partnership or simply a comfortable arrangement of mutual obligation. But she knew, with quiet certainty, that the man she had just agreed to marry was not the cold, distant figure society believed him to be. Whatever came next, she thought, she would face it with her eyes open, refusing to be swept along by circumstance without understanding, at every step, exactly what she was choosing and why. News of the engagement spread through London even faster than the scandal that had preceded it. Within 2 days, invitations began arriving at the Whitmore household from families who had barely acknowledged Elinor's existence a week earlier. Her mother moved through the house in a state of barely contained joy, already planning wedding preparations, while her father seemed to walk taller, relieved of a burden of worry that had weighed on him for years. Elinor found herself the subject of curious stares wherever she went, though the nature of the attention had shifted entirely from mockery to fascination. She was no longer the woman accused of scandal, but the woman who had captured the attention of the notoriously reserved Duke of Havenwood. She found the sudden reversal almost as unsettling as the cruelty that had preceded it, for she understood clearly that the same fickle society that now admired her could just as easily turn against her again. Constance Fairweather, she heard through a cousin's careful whispers, had retreated from public gatherings entirely following the humiliation of watching her carefully constructed lie collapse in an instant. Elinor felt no particular satisfaction in this news, only a quiet wariness. A woman who had shown herself willing to fabricate scandal once might well attempt it again, and Elinor suspected the matter was far from finished. For now, though, she turned her attention to the strange new reality unfolding before her. In a matter of days, she would become the Duchess of Havenwood, bound in marriage to a man she barely knew, a man whose quiet intensity and unexpected honesty had already begun to unsettle the careful boundaries she had built around her own heart. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a cool autumn morning beneath a sky the color of pale silver. Eleanor stood before the small stone chapel near the Havenwood estate, her hands trembling inside her gloves, watching the carriage that had carried her there roll away down the gravel drive. She had chosen a simple gown of ivory silk, unadorned by the elaborate lace and jewels that wealthier brides often favored, and though her mother had protested the simplicity, Eleanor had insisted. She did not wish to appear as though she were performing a role written for her by society. She wished, at the very least, to feel like herself on the one day that would change her life forever. Inside the chapel, only a small gathering of guests waited, far fewer than the grand spectacle many had expected from a ducal wedding. Sebastian had arranged it that way deliberately, choosing quiet dignity over public display, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the decision. She did not think she could have borne a wedding conducted under the same curious, hungry stares that had followed her through every social gathering since the night of the scandal. She walked down the narrow aisle on her father's arm, her heart pounding so loudly she felt certain everyone could hear it. At the altar, Sebastian waited, dressed in dark, understated formal clothing, his expression composed but his eyes, when they met hers, carrying something far warmer than the careful courtesy he usually displayed in public. The ceremony passed in a blur of quiet vows and solemn promises. Eleanor barely remembered the words she spoke, though she remembered clearly the steadiness of Sebastian's voice as he made his own vows, and the gentle, careful way he slid the ring onto her finger, as though handling something precious and fragile. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, a strange stillness settled over Eleanor. She was now the Duchess of Havenwood. The realization did not arrive with triumph or joy, but with a quiet, sobering weight, the understanding that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. The small wedding breakfast that followed passed pleasantly enough, filled with polite conversation and careful toasts. Eleanor's mother wept openly with happiness, while her father accepted congratulations with quiet, relieved pride. Sebastian remained close to Eleanor's side throughout, attentive in a way that surprised her, refilling her glass, ensuring she was comfortable, introducing her warmly to relatives and old family friends she had never met. It was not until later that afternoon, as they traveled by carriage toward Havenwood Estate itself, that Eleanor finally found herself alone with her new husband for an extended period. The carriage rocked gently along the country road, autumn leaves drifting past the windows in shades of gold and crimson. "You are quiet," Sebastian observed after several minutes of silence. "I am attempting to understand my new life," Eleanor admitted. "Yesterday I was Miss Whitmore, and today I am the Duchess of Havenwood. It is a great deal to absorb in a single day." "I imagine it is," Sebastian said. "If it offers any comfort, I felt much the same when I inherited my title. One day I was simply Sebastian, and the next, an entire estate and hundreds of lives depended upon my judgment. It took considerable time before the weight of it felt manageable." Eleanor studied him carefully. "How old were you when your father passed?" 22, Sebastian said. "Younger than I felt prepared for, though I do not believe any age would have felt sufficiently prepared." "Were you close to him, your father, I mean?" Something flickered briefly across Sebastian's expression, quickly smoothed away, though Eleanor caught it nonetheless. "Not particularly," he said. "My father believed a duke's duty left little room for warmth. He taught me a great deal about responsibility and very little about anything else." Eleanor heard the careful restraint in his voice, the sense that he had chosen his words with deliberate caution, revealing only as much as he intended to reveal. She did not press further, sensing that trust, if it developed between them at all, would need to grow slowly rather than be forced. "And your mother?" she asked instead. "She passed when I was quite young," Sebastian said. I remember very little of her, though the household staff who remain from that time speak of her fondly. They say she was warm where my father was not. I am sorry, Elinor said softly. Sebastian inclined his head in quiet acknowledgement. It was a long time ago. He paused, then added, What of your own family? You seem close to your parents. Elinor smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since the wedding began. We are close, yes, though we have never had much in the way of fortune. My father worked hard to provide what he could, and my mother managed our household with great care despite limited means. I suppose that is why the scandal frightened them so deeply. We had little to lose beyond our good name, and even that felt fragile enough without gossip threatening to destroy it entirely. You need not fear such things any longer, Sebastian said. Whatever else this marriage brings, it will provide security for your family and protection for your reputation. Elinor met his gaze steadily. I understand that, and I am grateful for it truly. But I confess, Your Grace, I hope this marriage might eventually offer something more than mere security. Sebastian's expression softened slightly. As do I, he admitted quietly, though I confess I am not entirely certain how to build such a thing. I have spent most of my life guarding against attachment, rather than pursuing it. Perhaps, Elinor said, we might learn together. The remainder of the journey passed in easier conversation than either had expected. Small exchanges about favorite books, childhood memories, and the quiet observations each had made of the other during their brief acquaintance before the scandal had thrown them together. By the time the carriage finally turned up the long drive toward Havenwood estate, Elinor found herself feeling, for the first time since the entire ordeal had begun, something faintly resembling hope. The estate itself took her breath away. Havenwood rose from the surrounding countryside like something from a painting, its gray stone walls softened by ivy climbing toward tall windows that caught the last golden light of the afternoon sun. Gardens stretched in careful, sweeping patterns around the main house, and beyond them, dense woodland marked the edges of the estate's considerable grounds. The household staff had gathered on the front steps to greet their new mistress, a long row of servants standing in careful order, their expressions curious but respectful. Sebastian introduced Elinor to each of them personally, from the stern but kindly housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, to the youngest kitchen maid, who could not have been more than 14 years old. Welcome home, Your Grace, Mrs. Pemberton said warmly, offering Elinor a genuine smile that put her instantly at ease. Elinor felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat at the words. Home. She had not expected the word to affect her so deeply, yet standing before the grand estate that now belonged to her as much as to her husband, she felt the beginning of something that might, in time, become genuine belonging. The following days passed in a whirlwind of adjustment. Elinor learned the layout of the sprawling house, familiarized herself with the daily rhythms of the household, and began, cautiously, to settle into her new role as Duchess. Sebastian remained attentive without being overbearing, offering guidance when she sought it, but allowing her the space to find her own footing within the household. It was during this period of quiet adjustment that Elinor first began to notice the subtle contradictions between the man society believed Sebastian to be, and the man she was slowly coming to know. Where society whispered of a cold, distant duke, Elinor witnessed a man who rose before dawn to review estate matters personally rather than leaving them entirely to stewards, who knew the names and circumstances of every tenant family on his land, who spent considerable time each week ensuring the well-being of those who depended upon him. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into their marriage, Elinor accompanied Sebastian on his weekly visit to the tenant farms. She had expected a brief, formal inspection, but instead found herself witnessing something far warmer. Sebastian spoke easily with each family, inquiring after sick children, offering practical assistance where needed, and listening with genuine attention to concerns about crops and livestock. You know them all so well, Elinor observed as they walked back toward the main house afterward, the autumn air crisp and fragrant with fallen leaves. They depend upon me, Sebastian said simply. It seems only right that I understand their lives well enough to serve them properly. Society believes you cold, you know, Elinor said, watching his reaction carefully. Sebastian's mouth twitched into something almost like amusement. Society believes a great many things that are not entirely accurate. Why do you allow such beliefs to persist? You could correct them easily enough, simply by behaving in society as you behave here. Sebastian considered the question for a long moment before answering. I suppose I have simply never seen the value in performing warmth for an audience that cares little for genuine connection. Society rewards appearance far more readily than substance. I would rather be misunderstood by strangers than pretend to feelings I do not have merely to win their approval. Elinor studied him thoughtfully. That is either remarkably principled or remarkably lonely. Perhaps it has been both, Sebastian admitted quietly. They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, the golden autumn light stretching long shadows across the estate grounds. Elinor found herself increasingly drawn to this quieter, more genuine version of her husband, the man who existed beneath the careful, controlled exterior he presented to the wider world. Yet even as their tentative understanding deepened, a shadow remained at the edges of Elinor's thoughts. She had not forgotten Constance Fairweather, nor the vicious efficiency with which the woman had once manufactured scandal to serve her own purposes. Elinor could not shake the quiet, persistent worry that a woman capable of such cruelty once would not hesitate to attempt it again, should the opportunity present itself. That worry proved well-founded sooner than Elinor expected. Nearly a month into her marriage, Elinor received an unexpected letter, delivered by a household servant with an apologetic expression, explaining that it had arrived without a return address and had been handled by several household staff before reaching her directly. Elinor opened it with a growing sense of unease, and as she read the contents, her blood ran cold. The letter contained no threats, exactly, nor any explicit accusation. It simply reminded Elinor, in carefully chosen and unsettlingly polite language, that reputations built quickly could crumble just as swiftly, and that certain individuals possessed knowledge capable of causing considerable difficulty for the newly established Duke and Duchess of Havenwood, should circumstances warrant it. Elinor read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling slightly, before folding it carefully and tucking it into the drawer of her writing desk. She considered showing it to Sebastian immediately, then hesitated, uncertain whether raising the matter so soon after their tentative peace had settled might disrupt the fragile trust beginning to grow between them. She decided, for the moment, to keep her own counsel, watching carefully for any further sign of the threat the letter implied. She did not yet know who had sent it, though she harbored strong suspicions regarding its author. What she did know, with growing certainty, was that whatever peace she and Sebastian had found together in these early weeks of marriage would soon be tested by forces neither of them could fully control. For now, though, she chose to focus on the quiet, unexpected warmth growing steadily between herself and the man she had married under such unusual circumstances. Whatever storms lay ahead, she intended to face them with clear eyes and a steady heart, just as she had faced the scandal that had brought them together in the first place. The weeks that followed brought a quiet rhythm to Elinor's new life, though the memory of the unsigned letter lingered at the back of her mind like a shadow she could not quite shake. She said nothing of it to Sebastian, choosing instead to watch and wait, hoping the threat, whatever its origin, might simply fade without further consequence. In the meantime, she allowed herself to focus on the slow, careful process of building something genuine with the man she had married. Havenwood itself, she discovered, held far more warmth than its imposing exterior suggested. The estate's library became one of her favorite refuges, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books collected across generations of the Ashford family. She spent many afternoons there, curled into a window seat with the autumn light spilling across the pages of whatever novel she had chosen, and it was not long before Sebastian began joining her. At first, their shared time in the library passed mostly in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own reading. Gradually, however, conversation began to fill the quiet spaces between them. Sebastian, she discovered, possessed a dry, understated wit that rarely showed itself in public settings but emerged easily in private moments, drawing genuine laughter from Alina more often than she expected. "You are nothing at all like the man society believes you to be," she told him one evening, closing her book as the fire crackled softly in the hearth beside them. "So you have said before," Sebastian replied, a faint smile touching his mouth. "Does that trouble you?" "Not at all," Alina said. "I find I much prefer this version of you." Something shifted in his expression at her words, warm and unguarded, and for a long moment neither spoke, the quiet charge of the moment settling comfortably between them. Alina felt her heart quicken slightly, surprised by how easily this man, once a stranger bound to her by scandal and obligation, had begun to occupy her thoughts. Their days settled into a pattern that felt, increasingly, less like practical arrangement and more like genuine partnership. Sebastian began seeking her opinion on estate matters, listening carefully to her observations about tenant welfare and household management. Alina, in turn, found herself genuinely invested in the well-being of Havenwood and its people, taking on responsibilities within the household with growing confidence and purpose. One crisp morning, nearly 6 weeks into their marriage, Alina discovered a talent she had not expected to find within herself. A dispute had arisen among several tenant families regarding water rights to a stream running along the border of 2 neighboring farms, and Sebastian, called away unexpectedly to attend to business in London, asked Alina to oversee the matter in his absence. She approached the dispute with careful diplomacy, listening patiently to both families' concerns before proposing a compromise that satisfied both parties without favoring either unfairly. When Sebastian returned 2 days later and learned how she had resolved the matter, he regarded her with open admiration. "You handled that admirably," he said. "Better, I suspect, than I might have managed myself." "I merely listened," Alina said, though she could not entirely hide her pleased smile. "It is remarkable how much conflict dissolves when people simply feel heard." "A lesson many rulers throughout history might have benefited from learning," Sebastian said dryly, and Alina laughed, delighted by the small joke. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the household staff, who began exchanging quiet, knowing glances whenever the Duke and Duchess lingered together longer than strictly necessary, or when Sebastian's carefully guarded expression softened unmistakably in his wife's presence. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, remarked once to a younger maid that she had not seen the young Duke smile so freely since before his father's passing, and the observation, whispered quietly among the staff, brought Alina a private, quiet satisfaction whenever it reached her ears. Yet even as warmth grew steadily between them, Alina remained cautious about revealing her deeper feelings. She had entered this marriage prepared for practicality, not romance, and she found herself uncertain how to navigate the unexpected tenderness developing within her heart. She feared, too, admitting such feelings too openly, only to discover that Sebastian's growing warmth toward her stemmed merely from comfortable companionship rather than anything deeper. It was during a quiet evening walk through the estate gardens, nearly 2 months into their marriage, that circumstances forced the matter into the open. The gardens at Havenwood stretched wide and carefully tended, filled even in the cooling autumn air with the last fragrant blooms of the season. Alina and Sebastian walked slowly along a stone path bordered by tall hedges, the last light of evening painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. "I have been thinking," Sebastian said, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them, "about the circumstances that brought us together." Alina glanced at him curiously. "Oh. I acted that night at the ball without fully considering the consequences to you," he continued. "I have thought of it often since, wondering whether you have come to resent the choice that was, in many ways, forced upon you." Alina stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "I did resent it at first," she admitted honestly. "I felt as though my future had been decided for me, without my consent, in the space of a single moment." Sebastian's expression grew troubled. "I feared as much. But I no longer feel that way," Alina continued gently. These past weeks have shown me a man far different from the one I expected to marry. I have come to value your honesty, your quiet dedication to those who depend upon you, and your patience with me as I have found my place within this new life. Whatever regret I once carried has faded considerably. And what remains in its place? Sebastian asked quietly, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. Alina hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. Something that feels remarkably like genuine affection, your grace, though I confess the realization surprises me as much as it may surprise you. Sebastian stepped closer, reaching out to gently take her hand. It does not surprise me nearly as much as you might expect, he said softly. I find myself, more each day, looking forward to your company above all else. I did not anticipate feeling such things when we first agreed to this arrangement, yet here I find myself, unable to imagine Havenwood or my life without you in it. Alina's heart swelled with quiet joy at his words, though before she could respond, a sudden gust of wind stirred the garden hedges, and she caught sight of movement near the estate's outer wall, a figure moving quickly away into the shadows beyond the gardens. "Did you see that?" she asked, her earlier warmth giving way to sudden alarm. Sebastian turned sharply toward where she pointed, but the figure, whoever it had been, had already vanished into the darkening woods beyond the estate boundary. "Perhaps merely a servant taking a shortcut home," he said, though his tone carried a note of caution that told Alina he did not entirely believe his own reassurance. Alina said nothing further about the unsigned letter still hidden in her writing desk, though the sighting revived her earlier unease with renewed force. She could not shake the growing certainty that someone had been watching them, someone with reasons of their own for monitoring the private life unfolding behind Havenwood's walls. That night, after retiring to her chambers, Alina finally retrieved the letter from where she had kept it hidden and read it once more by candlelight, studying the careful, unfamiliar handwriting for any clue as to its author. She thought again of Constance Fairweather, of the woman's humiliation at the ball and her subsequent withdrawal from society, and wondered whether resentment, left to fester quietly, might have grown into something far more dangerous than simple gossip. She resolved at last that she could no longer keep the matter to herself. Whatever threat loomed at the edges of her newfound happiness, she would not face it alone, hidden behind careful secrecy. She and Sebastian had built something genuine together in these past weeks, a partnership founded on honesty and mutual respect, and she owed him the truth now more than ever. The following morning she found him in his study, reviewing correspondence at his desk, and without preamble she placed the letter before him. "This arrived nearly a month ago," she said quietly. "I should have shown it to you sooner. I am sorry I did not." Sebastian read the letter carefully, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at her, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "Why did you not tell me immediately?" "I did not wish to disrupt what we were only beginning to build together," Alina admitted. "I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the threat would simply fade on its own." Sebastian rose from his desk, crossing the room to take her hands gently in his own. "Whatever threatens you threatens us both, Alina. You need never carry such burdens alone again. We face this together, as partners, exactly as we have faced everything else since the night we married." Alina felt tears sting her eyes at his words, moved deeply by the quiet certainty in his voice. "Together," she repeated softly. "Together," Sebastian confirmed, drawing her gently into an embrace that felt, for the first time since their strange and unexpected union had begun, entirely and completely like home. Yet even as comfort settled between them, both understood that the shadow hinted at within the letter's careful words had not yet fully revealed itself. Somewhere beyond the safety of Havenwood's walls, someone remained determined to disrupt the fragile happiness they had built together, and neither Alina nor Sebastian yet knew how far that determination might ultimately reach. In the days that followed, Sebastian quietly began his own investigation into the source of the letter, careful not to alarm the household staff, or draw unwanted attention from the wider society that still watched their marriage with curious interest. He sent trusted inquiries to acquaintances in London, asking discreetly after Constance Fairweather's recent activities, and instructed his estate steward to keep careful watch over the grounds, particularly near the outer wall where Alina had spotted the mysterious figure. What he learned within the week troubled him considerably. Constance Fairweather had indeed retreated from society following her public humiliation, but she had not retreated far. She had taken up residence at the estate of a distant cousin only a day's journey from Havenwood, and more troubling still, Sebastian's inquiries revealed that she had been seen in recent company with a man named Edmund Ashford, a distant relation of Sebastian's own family who stood, by an obscure but legally valid line of inheritance, as the next male heir to the Havenwood title should Sebastian's own line fail to produce an heir. Sebastian brought this information to Alina one evening in his study, his expression grave as he laid out what he had discovered. "Edmund and I have never been close," he explained, pacing slowly before the fire. "He resented my father greatly for what he considered an unjust distribution of family wealth generations ago, and he has made no secret over the years of his belief that the title should rightfully belong to his branch of the family. I did not think much of his grievances until now, but if he has aligned himself with Constance Fairweather, the implications trouble me greatly." Alina felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "You believe they mean to harm our marriage in order to prevent an heir from securing your line?" "I believe it is possible," Sebastian said grimly. "Constance's original scandal against you may have been born from simple jealousy and cruelty, but if Edmund has since offered her incentive to continue her campaign, her motives may now run considerably deeper than mere spite." Alina rose from her chair, moving to stand beside him near the fire. "What do we do?" "We remain vigilant," Sebastian said, "and we do not allow fear to alter how we live our lives. Whatever they intend, we will not give them the satisfaction of watching us retreat behind fear and suspicion." Despite his confident words, the following weeks carried an undercurrent of quiet tension that neither of them could fully ignore. Sebastian doubled the estate's household security, quietly instructing the groundskeepers to remain alert for any unfamiliar visitors near the property's boundaries. Alina, for her part, found herself glancing more frequently toward windows and darkened corridors, a habit she despised but could not entirely shake. The true danger revealed itself nearly 3 weeks later, on an afternoon that began with nothing more troubling than an invitation to a neighboring estate's autumn gathering. Lord and Lady Winslow, longtime friends of the Ashford family, had invited Sebastian and Alina to a small country gathering intended to celebrate the harvest season, and despite the lingering unease surrounding recent events, Sebastian judged the outing safe enough, surrounded as it would be by trusted friends and familiar company. They set out by carriage in the early afternoon, the autumn countryside blazing with color beneath a bright, clear sky. Alina found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, enjoying the easy conversation with Sebastian as their carriage wound along the familiar country road toward the Winslow estate. The attack, when it came, arrived without warning. A sudden, violent jolt threw Alina hard against the carriage wall as the vehicle lurched sharply to one side. She heard the driver shout in alarm, followed by the terrifying sound of splintering wood and screaming horses. The carriage tilted dangerously, and for one horrifying moment, Alina believed they would overturn entirely. Sebastian threw his arms around her instinctively, bracing them both against the worst of the impact as the carriage finally shuddered to a violent, uneven stop, tilted precariously at the edge of the road where a wheel had apparently broken free entirely. "Alina, are you hurt?" Sebastian demanded urgently, his hands moving quickly over her shoulders and arms, checking for injury. "I am well, I think," Alina managed, though her heart pounded violently and her hands trembled uncontrollably. "What happened?" Sebastian did not answer immediately, instead pushing open the carriage door and climbing out to assess the damage. Alina followed cautiously, her legs unsteady beneath her, and found the driver already examining the broken wheel with a deeply troubled expression. "Your Grace," the driver said grimly, "this wheel did not break by accident. Look here, the wood has been cut nearly through, cleverly enough to hold for a time before giving way entirely." Sebastian crouched beside the wheel, examining it closely, his expression darkening with each passing moment. "Deliberately sabotaged," he confirmed quietly, rising to his feet with barely restrained fury evident in his tightened jaw. "Had we been traveling at greater speed or along a sharper curve, the consequences could have been far more severe." Elinor felt the full weight of what had nearly happened settle over her, cold and sickening. "Someone tried to hurt us," she said softly. "Truly hurt us, not merely frighten us with an anonymous letter." Sebastian's expression, when he turned to her, carried a fierce protectiveness that steadied her trembling nerves even amid her fear. "No one will harm you while I draw breath," he said firmly. "I promise you that, Elinor, whatever it costs me to keep such a promise." They were fortunate that another traveler, a local farmer returning from market, happened upon the scene shortly afterward and offered assistance in securing alternate transportation back to Havenwood. Sebastian sent word immediately to the local magistrate, reporting the sabotage and requesting a thorough investigation, though he harbored little hope that such an investigation would yield conclusive proof against whoever had arranged the attack. That evening, safely returned to the estate, Elinor sat wrapped in a warm blanket before the fire in their private sitting room, still shaken from the day's events. Sebastian paced before her, his usual composure entirely abandoned in favor of barely contained anger and fear. "I should never have taken you on that road," he said, more to himself than to her. "I should have anticipated greater danger after the letter, taken greater precautions." "You could not have known," Elinor said gently, though her own voice still carried a slight tremor. "Neither of us anticipated they would resort to such direct violence." Sebastian stopped his pacing, kneeling before her chair and taking her hands firmly in his own. "I cannot lose you, Elinor. Not now, not after everything we have built together these past months. If something had happened to you today, I do not know how I would have borne it." Elinor's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words, at the fear and love so plainly visible in his expression. "Nothing happened," she reminded him softly. "We are both safe." "This time," Sebastian said grimly. "But I fear whoever arranged this will not simply abandon their scheme after a single failed attempt. We must take this threat far more seriously than we have thus far." Over the following days, Sebastian's investigation intensified considerably. He traveled personally to speak with the local magistrate, pressed his contacts in London for further information regarding Edmund Ashford's recent activities and financial circumstances, and arranged for additional trusted men to patrol the estate grounds both day and night. Elinor, though frightened by the escalating danger, refused to remain idle, insisting on accompanying Sebastian in reviewing correspondence and household records for any clue that might reveal the conspirators' next intended move. It was during one such review, late one evening nearly a week after the carriage incident, that Elinor discovered something significant among a stack of old estate correspondence that Sebastian had requested from the family archives. "Sebastian," she said suddenly, her voice tight with excitement, "look at this." She held out an old letter, yellowed with age, written many years earlier by Sebastian's late father to his own solicitor. The letter detailed a private arrangement regarding the family's succession laws, specifically addressing concerns about Edmund Ashford's branch of the family and outlining legal steps taken decades earlier to formally and permanently exclude that branch from any claim to the Havenwood title, regardless of circumstance. Sebastian read the letter carefully, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning understanding. "This changes everything," he said slowly. "If this arrangement holds legal weight, Edmund's claim to the title, even should something happen to prevent me from producing an heir, would be entirely without merit. His entire motivation for conspiring against us would be founded on a misunderstanding of his own legal standing." "Then perhaps," Elinor said carefully, If he learns the truth, he might abandon his scheme entirely, recognizing that whatever harm he causes us would gain him nothing in the end. Sebastian nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. Perhaps, though men driven by resentment and jealousy do not always act according to rational calculation. We cannot simply assume the danger has passed merely because his legal claim proves baseless. Still, the discovery offered a crucial advantage, a piece of leverage they had not possessed before. Sebastian immediately dispatched a letter to his family's longtime solicitor in London, requesting formal verification of the old arrangement and instructions on how best to proceed should the information need to be presented publicly or legally to definitively end Edmund's claim. While they awaited the solicitor's response, life at Havenwood continued under a careful, watchful tension neither Elinor nor Sebastian could fully shake. Yet even amid the danger surrounding them, Elinor found herself grateful for one thing above all else. Whatever threats loomed beyond the estate's walls, she no longer faced them alone. She and Sebastian stood together now, bound not merely by obligation or practical arrangement, but by a partnership forged through genuine trust, growing affection, and an unshakable commitment to protect one another, whatever dangers still lay ahead. The solicitor's response arrived 9 days later, confirming everything the old letter had suggested. The legal arrangement excluding Edmund Ashford's branch of the family from any claim to the Havenwood title had indeed been properly executed decades earlier, filed correctly with the appropriate courts, and remained fully binding under law. Whatever Edmund believed about his own prospects, his claim to the title, under any circumstance, held no legal weight whatsoever. Sebastian read the confirmation twice before setting it down on his desk, exhaling slowly. "Now we know the truth of it," he said. "The question remains what Edmund and Constance intend to do with that truth once it reaches them." "Perhaps we should confront them directly," Elinor suggested. "If Edmund learns definitively that his scheme can never succeed, regardless of what harm he causes us, he may finally abandon it entirely rather than risk further exposure for nothing." Sebastian considered this carefully. "It carries risk," he admitted. "Confronting them directly means revealing how much we already know, which could provoke a more desperate response rather than a peaceful surrender. Yet continuing to wait, uncertain of their next move, carries its own dangers as well." They debated the matter late into the evening before finally settling on a plan. Sebastian would request a private meeting with Edmund, using the pretext of family business, while quietly ensuring that trusted allies remained nearby should the confrontation turn dangerous. Elinor insisted on accompanying him, despite Sebastian's initial reluctance to expose her to further risk. "I will not remain hidden away at Havenwood while you face this alone," she told him firmly. "We agreed to face these dangers together, and I intend to honor that agreement." Sebastian studied her for a long moment before finally nodding, recognizing the same quiet determination in her expression that had first drawn his admiration months earlier. "Together, then," he agreed. The meeting was arranged to take place at a small, private inn roughly halfway between Havenwood and the estate where Edmund currently resided, chosen deliberately as neutral ground where neither party held obvious advantage. Sebastian arranged for 2 trusted former soldiers, men who had served under his father years earlier and remained fiercely loyal to the Ashford family, to accompany them discreetly, remaining out of sight but close enough to intervene should circumstances demand it. They arrived at the appointed hour on a gray, overcast afternoon, the inn's private meeting room already occupied when they entered. Edmund Ashford rose from his seat at their arrival, a tall, thin man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes that reminded Elinor uncomfortably of a predator assessing prey. Beside him, Constance Fairweather sat with an expression of carefully controlled composure, though Elinor noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested the woman was far less confident than she wished to appear. "Cousin," Edmund said, his voice smooth and unreadable, "I confess surprise at your request for this meeting. To what do I owe the honor?" "I believe you know precisely why we are here," Sebastian said, his tone carrying none of his usual careful diplomacy. The sabotaged carriage wheel, the threatening letter, the man seen watching our estate grounds. I have spent considerable effort tracing these events back to their source, and that source, I have discovered, leads directly to you and your associate here. Constance's composure cracked slightly at this direct accusation, though Edmund's expression remained infuriatingly calm. Serious accusations, cousin, without any proof to support them. I have proof enough, Sebastian said coldly. Witnesses who observed you meeting with Miss Fairweather on multiple occasions, a driver who confirmed the carriage wheel had been deliberately compromised, and a household servant who recognized a man matching your description watching our estate grounds late one evening. Should I choose to present this evidence formally to the magistrate, I suspect it would prove sufficient grounds for a thorough investigation into your activities. Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack in his careful composure. Even if such accusations held merit, cousin, you would find it difficult to prove any connection to actual harm caused. Suspicion alone rarely satisfies a court of law. Perhaps not, Sebastian acknowledged. But there is a more pressing matter you should be aware of, one that renders your entire scheme entirely pointless regardless of what evidence can or cannot be proven. He withdrew the solicitor's confirmed documentation from within his coat and placed it deliberately on the table before Edmund. This is a legally binding arrangement, executed by my father decades ago and confirmed just this week by our family solicitor. It permanently and irrevocably excludes your branch of the family from any claim to the Havenwood title, under any circumstance whatsoever. Whatever harm you have caused, or intended to cause, against myself or my wife, it will gain you absolutely nothing. The title was never within your reach to begin with. Edmund's hands trembled slightly as he read through the document, his earlier composure crumbling entirely as understanding dawned across his sharp features. This cannot be accurate, he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. I assure you it is entirely accurate, Sebastian said. You have risked everything, endangered innocent lives, and committed acts that could see you imprisoned for years, all in pursuit of a claim that never existed in the first place. Constance had gone pale beside Edmund, her eyes darting between the document and Sebastian's unyielding expression. I had no part in any violence, she said quickly, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. The letter, yes, that was my doing, born of foolish jealousy and hurt pride following the ball. But I knew nothing of any carriage, nothing of any sabotage. Edmund approached me only after the scandal, offering resources and support if I continued pressuring the family, but I swear to you, I had no knowledge of any plan to cause physical harm. Elinor watched the exchange carefully, studying Edmund's expression for any sign of the truth behind Constance's claim. Whatever cruelty the woman had shown in spreading her original lie, Elinor sensed genuine fear now in her voice, fear that suggested she had indeed been drawn into something far more dangerous than she had originally intended. Is this true? Sebastian demanded of Edmund directly. Did you act alone in arranging the sabotage of our carriage? Edmund's expression had grown increasingly desperate as the full weight of his failed scheme settled over him. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Elinor watched something dangerous flicker behind his cold eyes, a man realizing he had nothing left to lose. Without warning, Edmund lunged suddenly toward the door, apparently intent on fleeing the confrontation entirely rather than facing further consequence. Sebastian moved instantly, catching his cousin's arm and forcing him back into his seat with considerable strength. Running will only confirm your guilt, Sebastian said sharply. Sit down and let us finish this conversation properly. Edmund struggled briefly against Sebastian's grip before finally slumping back into his chair, all fight seemingly drained from him at once. What do you intend to do with me? He asked, his voice hollow. Sebastian released his cousin's arm, stepping back with careful control, though Elinor could see the tension still held tightly in his shoulders. That depends entirely on your willingness to confess fully and completely to what you have done, and to ensure no further harm comes to myself or my wife going forward." Over the following hour, Edmund's confession poured out in halting, reluctant admissions. He had indeed arranged for the carriage sabotage himself, hiring a local man familiar with wheelwright work to compromise the vehicle without detection, hoping to cause enough of an accident to frighten Alina and Sebastian into reconsidering their marriage, or failing that, to cause sufficient harm that Sebastian himself might be prevented from producing an heir, leaving the succession open to challenge regardless of the old legal arrangement he had not known existed. Alina felt sick listening to the calculated cruelty behind his admissions, the willingness to risk both their lives merely to satisfy old resentments and misguided ambition. Yet she also felt, beneath her anger, a measure of relief that the truth had finally come fully into the light, that the shadow hanging over their marriage these past months had finally been identified and confronted directly. By the meeting's conclusion, Sebastian had extracted a full written confession from Edmund, along with a formal agreement that he would leave England entirely, relocating to distant relatives in the colonies rather than face the full legal consequences his actions warranted. It was, Sebastian explained later to Alina, a mercy he offered reluctantly, motivated primarily by a desire to avoid the scandal and public spectacle a formal trial would bring upon the family name, rather than any genuine forgiveness for what his cousin had done. Constance, for her part, received a sterner warning, along with the clear understanding that any further attempt to spread malicious gossip or involve herself in further schemes against the Ashford family would result in immediate and severe legal consequence, regardless of the discretion Sebastian had shown in this instance. As they finally departed the inn that evening, the threat that had shadowed their marriage for months finally resolved, Alina felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over her, tempered by the lingering exhaustion of the day's tense confrontation. Sebastian helped her into their carriage, this time thoroughly inspected beforehand by their own trusted men, and settled beside her as the vehicle began its journey back toward Havenwood beneath a darkening evening sky. "It is finally over," Alina said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as the tension of the day began slowly draining from her exhausted body. "It is," Sebastian agreed, wrapping his arm protectively around her. "Whatever difficulties still lie ahead, at least we no longer face this particular shadow hanging over us." Alina closed her eyes, allowing herself, for the first time in weeks, to feel genuinely safe. Whatever trials had brought them to this point, whatever danger they had faced together and overcome, she understood now with complete certainty that the bond between them had grown into something far stronger than mere obligation or practical arrangement. They had faced genuine danger together, protected one another fiercely, and emerged from the ordeal bound more closely than ever before. Yet even as relief settled over her, Alina understood that greater emotional honesty still awaited them both. They had weathered external threats together with remarkable unity, but the deeper question of what truly existed between them, whether the growing affection each had come to feel for the other might yet blossom into something even more profound, remained still unspoken between them, waiting patiently for the right moment to finally be acknowledged. Word of Edmund Ashford's sudden departure for the colonies spread quietly through certain circles of society over the following weeks, though the true reasons behind his abrupt relocation remained known only to those directly involved. Sebastian had been careful to control the narrative, allowing only the vaguest suggestion of a family disagreement to circulate, sufficient to explain Edmund's absence without revealing the full extent of his cousin's dangerous scheming. Constance Fairweather, meanwhile, retreated even further from public life. Rarely seen at gatherings, she had once dominated with her sharp wit and carefully cultivated influence. Whispers suggested she had grown genuinely humbled by recent events, though whether from authentic remorse or simple fear of further consequence, Alina could not say with certainty, nor did she particularly care to speculate further. The immediate danger had passed, and she found herself far more interested in building the life ahead of her than dwelling further on the schemes that had nearly destroyed it. Yet even with the direct threat resolved, Alina sensed that lingering questions about the circumstances of her marriage still colored certain corners of society. Though most had accepted the narrative of a genuine love match born from an admittedly unusual beginning, a few particularly persistent gossips continued to whisper that the marriage remained one of obligation rather than affection, a duty dutifully performed rather than a partnership genuinely embraced. It was Lady Winslow, in fact, who finally brought the matter directly to Alina's attention, during a visit to Havenwood nearly 2 months after the confrontation with Edmund. "You must forgive me for speaking so plainly," Lady Winslow said, settling into a comfortable chair in the estate's drawing room as afternoon tea was served between them. "But I do think it would benefit you both greatly to appear more openly at society gatherings again. Certain persistent voices continue suggesting your marriage remains a cold arrangement of convenience, and I confess it troubles me to hear such unkind speculation continue, particularly when I have witnessed with my own eyes how genuinely devoted you and the Duke have become to one another." Alina considered her friend's words carefully. She had, admittedly, grown somewhat comfortable in the quiet privacy of Havenwood these past months, content to build her relationship with Sebastian away from the prying eyes and endless speculation of wider society. Yet she understood, too, that hiding away entirely would only fuel further rumor rather than dispel it. That evening, she raised the matter with Sebastian over dinner, watching his expression carefully as she explained Lady Winslow's gentle suggestion. "She is not entirely wrong," Sebastian admitted after a moment's thought. "I confess I have rather enjoyed our quiet privacy these past months, away from society's constant scrutiny. But perhaps it is time we allowed ourselves to be seen again, on our own terms this time, rather than as subjects of scandal or speculation." "There is a ball at the Pemberton estate next week," Alina said. Lady Winslow mentioned it specifically, suggesting it might offer an appropriate occasion. Sebastian reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his own. "Then let us attend together, and let society see for themselves exactly what exists between us, without need for further speculation or doubt." The ball, when the evening finally arrived, brought Alina an unexpected wave of nervous anticipation, as their carriage approached the brightly lit Pemberton estate. She had not attended a large society gathering since the night of the original scandal so many months earlier, and despite the genuine confidence she had gained in the months since, she could not entirely shake a lingering unease at the thought of facing such scrutiny once again. Sebastian seemed to sense her nervousness as they approached the grand entrance, reaching over to squeeze her hand gently. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that we face it together," he said quietly. "You need not fear their whispers any longer, Alina. You are the Duchess of Havenwood, and nothing they say can alter the truth of what we have built together." His words steadied her considerably, and she entered the ballroom on his arm with her chin held high, meeting the curious stares of assembled guests with calm, unwavering composure rather than the anxious uncertainty she might have shown months earlier. The evening passed pleasantly enough at first, filled with polite conversation and careful pleasantries from guests eager to reconnect with the notoriously private Duke and Duchess. Yet Alina noticed, throughout the evening, small clusters of guests exchanging quiet whispers whenever she and Sebastian passed, and she caught fragments of conversation suggesting that some persistent doubt about the genuine nature of their marriage still lingered despite months of apparent domestic happiness. It was during a quiet moment near the refreshment table that the matter finally came to a direct and unavoidable confrontation. A woman Alina recognized vaguely as a distant acquaintance of Constance Fairweather approached with a falsely sympathetic smile, her voice pitched deliberately loud enough for surrounding guests to overhear. "Your Grace," the woman said, addressing Alina directly, "I do hope your marriage has settled comfortably despite its rather unusual beginning. It must be difficult, knowing your husband married you purely from a sense of obligation rather than genuine affection. Such arrangements rarely produce true happiness, I fear, whatever appearances might suggest otherwise." The words, deliberately cruel despite their falsely gentle delivery, struck Alina with unexpected force, reviving painful memories of the humiliation she had suffered at that first fateful ball so many months earlier. She felt her cheeks flush, felt the familiar weight of curious eyes turning toward her once again, waiting to see how she might respond. Before Alina could formulate a reply, Sebastian's voice cut clearly across the space between them, firm and unmistakably resolute. "I believe you are gravely mistaken, madam," he said, stepping forward to stand protectively beside Alina, his expression carrying none of his usual careful diplomacy. "Whatever unusual circumstances brought my wife and myself together, I assure you that nothing about my feelings toward her stems from mere obligation." The surrounding conversation quieted noticeably as other guests turned to listen, drawn by the unmistakable conviction in the Duke's voice. "I married Alina initially believing I owed her a debt of honor," Sebastian continued, his gaze never leaving Alina's face as he spoke. "But in the months since, that sense of obligation has transformed into something far deeper and far more genuine than I ever anticipated when we first exchanged our vows. I love my wife, completely and without reservation, and I will not stand quietly by while anyone suggests otherwise, whatever malicious rumor they might wish to spread." The words settled over the surrounding crowd like a physical force, and Alina felt her breath catch entirely at the raw sincerity in his voice. He had never before spoken such words aloud, not even in the privacy of their own home, and hearing them declared so publicly, so unmistakably, filled her with an overwhelming rush of emotion she could barely contain. The woman who had spoken so cruelly moments earlier flushed deeply, murmuring a hasty apology before retreating quickly into the surrounding crowd, clearly unprepared for such a direct and passionate response. Around them, Alina caught sight of numerous approving nods and warm smiles from guests who had witnessed the exchange, the last lingering doubts about the genuine nature of their marriage finally and thoroughly dispelled. Sebastian turned to Alina once the crowd's attention had shifted elsewhere, his expression softening considerably as he studied her face carefully. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I had not intended to declare such feelings so publicly, nor so suddenly. I had hoped perhaps for a quieter, more private moment." Alina shook her head, tears of genuine joy threatening at the corners of her eyes despite her best efforts to maintain composure amid the crowded ballroom. "Do not apologize," she said softly. "I have waited months to hear such words from you, Sebastian. I care not at all that you chose to speak them here, before all of society, rather than in some quieter, more private setting." "Do you mean that?" he asked, searching her expression carefully. "With my whole heart," Alina confirmed. "I love you as well, Sebastian, completely and without reservation, exactly as you have just described your own feelings toward me. I have felt it for weeks now, though I confess I feared voicing such feelings before you had spoken your own." Sebastian's expression transformed entirely at her words, the careful control he maintained in public settings giving way to open, unguarded joy. Without hesitation, he reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, drawing her close. "May I kiss you again?" he asked softly, a faint echo of amusement touching his voice as he recalled the circumstances of their very first kiss, so different in nature from this quiet, deliberate moment now unfolding between them. "Always," Alina whispered. This time, when their lips met, there was no scandal to silence, no cruel rumor to counter, no calculated strategy behind the gesture. There was only genuine love, freely given and freely received, witnessed by a ballroom full of guests who watched with open admiration rather than cruel speculation. As they finally parted, Sebastian kept his arms wrapped gently around her, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "It seems fitting, does it not," he murmured, "that a kiss which once began as an act of protection has now become a genuine declaration of love." Alina smiled, her heart fuller than she had ever imagined possible. "Fitting indeed," she agreed softly, "though I confess I much prefer this particular kiss to the first." Around them the ball continued, music swelling once more as guests returned to dancing and conversation, though Alina barely noticed the surrounding activity at all. In that single, perfect moment, surrounded by the very society that had once threatened to destroy her, she felt only the overwhelming warmth of genuine love, finally and openly declared between herself and the man she had come, against every expectation, to love completely. The months following the Pemberton ball brought a settled, quiet happiness to Havenwood that Alina had scarcely dared to imagine possible during those first uncertain weeks of her marriage. Word of Sebastian's public declaration had spread quickly through society, and where once whispers had questioned the genuine nature of their union, now the story of the Duke and Duchess of Havenwood had become something of a favorite tale among the ton, retold and embellished with each fresh telling, until it had transformed entirely from scandal into celebrated romance. Alina found she no longer minded the attention nearly as much as she once had. Where the whispers that had once surrounded her carried cruelty and suspicion, they now carried genuine warmth and admiration, and she discovered that being known throughout society as a woman who had found true love amid unlikely circumstances brought her a quiet, unexpected satisfaction. Winter settled over Havenwood with its usual quiet beauty, snow blanketing the estate grounds in soft white stillness, the bare trees standing stark and elegant against pale gray skies. Alina spent many contented hours during those cold months curled beside the library fire with Sebastian, their earlier careful conversations having long since given way to easy, comfortable intimacy built on genuine trust and deepening affection. It was during one such quiet evening, as snow fell softly beyond the tall library windows, that Alina shared news with Sebastian that would change both their lives once again. "I have something to tell you," she said, setting aside the book she had been only half reading, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of nervousness and barely contained excitement. Sebastian looked up immediately, sensing the shift in her tone. "What is it?" "I visited with Dr. Alcott this morning," Alina said carefully, "regarding certain symptoms I have noticed these past weeks." She paused, watching his expression carefully. "He confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. I am expecting a child, Sebastian. We are to be parents by early summer." For a long moment, Sebastian simply stared at her, entirely still, as though the words needed time to fully settle into understanding. Then, slowly, an expression of pure, unguarded joy spread across his features, transforming his usually composed face entirely. "A child," he repeated softly, rising from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands gently in his own. "Alina, this is wonderful news, truly wonderful." "You are pleased?" she asked, though his expression left little doubt as to the answer. "More than pleased," Sebastian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had not allowed myself to hope for such happiness, not after everything that brought us together initially. To think that our marriage, born from such unlikely circumstances, should now bring forth new life entirely of its own." He paused, studying her face with tender wonder. "I love you more than I have words to properly express, Alina. This news only deepens that love further still." Alina felt tears of happiness slip freely down her cheeks as Sebastian gently pressed a kiss to her hands, then rose to embrace her fully, holding her close as though she were the most precious thing in his entire world. News of the impending arrival spread quickly through the household staff, bringing genuine celebration throughout Havenwood. Mrs. Pemberton immediately began preparations for the nursery, while other staff members offered warm congratulations whenever Alina passed through the estate's familiar corridors. Even the tenant families, upon learning the news during Sebastian's regular visits, expressed genuine joy at the prospect of a new heir to secure the Havenwood legacy for generations to come. Alina's own parents, informed by careful letter, responded with overwhelming excitement, her mother immediately announcing plans to visit Havenwood as frequently as possible throughout the remaining months of pregnancy, eager to offer whatever support and guidance she could provide as Alina prepared for motherhood. As winter gradually gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, Alina found herself reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point in her life. She thought back frequently to that terrible night at the ball so many months earlier, the cruel accusation that had threatened to destroy her reputation entirely, and the unexpected, impulsive kiss that had, against every reasonable expectation, ultimately led her toward a life filled with genuine love and happiness, beyond anything she could have previously imagined. She thought, too, of Constance Fairweather, whose jealousy and cruelty had inadvertently set this entire chain of events into motion. Elinor felt, surprisingly, no lingering bitterness toward the woman, only a quiet, distant pity for someone who had clearly allowed resentment and insecurity to drive her toward such destructive behavior. She heard occasionally, through careful society gossip, that Constance had eventually left London entirely, retreating to a quieter life in the countryside, though whether she had found any genuine peace there, Elinor could not say with certainty. Edmund Ashford, too, remained largely forgotten as the months passed, his brief, dangerous scheme having ultimately achieved nothing beyond his own exile from the family and homeland he had once hoped to claim through deception and violence. Sebastian rarely spoke of his cousin, and Elinor sensed he preferred to leave that particular chapter of their story firmly in the past, focusing instead on the genuine happiness that had emerged despite every obstacle placed before them. As spring blossomed fully across the Havenwood estate, Elinor's pregnancy progressed steadily, and with it, the deepening bond between herself and Sebastian continued to flourish in ways she had never anticipated when they first exchanged their vows under such unusual circumstances. He remained constantly attentive throughout the final months of her pregnancy, adjusting his own schedule to ensure he could accompany her on gentle walks through the estate gardens, reading aloud to her in the evenings when she grew too tired to hold a book herself, and generally displaying a tenderness that continued to surprise even those household staff who had grown accustomed to witnessing genuine affection between their master and mistress. It was on a warm morning in early summer, nearly exactly 1 year after that fateful ball where their story had first begun, that Elinor went into labor. The following hours passed in an anxious blur for Sebastian, who paced the corridors outside her chambers with barely restrained worry, refusing every suggestion that he retire to his study or seek distraction elsewhere while awaiting news. When the cry of a newborn infant finally echoed through the estate late that evening, Sebastian rushed immediately to Elinor's side, finding her exhausted but radiant, cradling a small, healthy infant wrapped carefully in soft blankets. "A daughter," the midwife announced with a warm smile. "Healthy and strong, Your Grace." Sebastian moved to Elinor's bedside, gazing down at his newborn daughter with an expression of overwhelming wonder and love. "She is perfect," he said softly, reaching out carefully to touch the infant's tiny hand. "We should name her," Elinor said softly, exhaustion evident in her voice though her eyes shone with quiet joy. "I had thought, perhaps, Charlotte after my grandmother." "Charlotte," Sebastian repeated, testing the name gently. "Charlotte Ashford, future Duchess of Havenwood, though I hope her path to that title carries far less scandal than her mother's own journey." Elinor laughed softly, exhaustion giving way briefly to genuine amusement. "I rather think our daughter's story, whatever it may hold, will be entirely her own, unburdened by the circumstances that shaped ours." Sebastian settled carefully onto the edge of the bed beside her, wrapping his arm gently around both his wife and newborn daughter. "Whatever her story becomes," he said quietly, "I hope she learns, eventually, the full truth of how her parents came to love one another. A cruel rumor, an impulsive kiss meant only to protect, and a marriage that began from obligation but grew, through patience and honesty, into something far deeper and more genuine than either of us dared hope for at the beginning." Elinor rested her head against his shoulder, gazing down at their sleeping daughter with quiet contentment. "It is a rather unusual love story," she admitted softly, "but I would not trade it for any other." "Nor would I," Sebastian agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Whatever difficulties brought us together, and whatever dangers we faced along the way, I would choose this path again without hesitation, simply to arrive at this exact moment, here with you and our daughter." Outside their window, the last golden light of the summer evening spread softly across the Havenwood estate, The gardens Alina had grown to love so deeply now blooming in full, vibrant color beneath the fading sky. Within the grand old house that had once felt so unfamiliar and daunting, Alina now felt entirely, completely at home, surrounded by a love she had never expected to find. Born from circumstances neither she nor Sebastian could have possibly predicted when their story first began amid the cruel whispers of a crowded ballroom. Their marriage, which had started as a desperate act of honor meant to silence vicious gossip, had transformed steadily over the course of a single remarkable year into something far more profound. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and a love that had weathered scandal, danger, and uncertainty to emerge stronger and more resilient than either of them could have possibly imagined. As Sebastian gently took their newborn daughter into his own arms for the first time, cradling her with careful, tender wonder, Alina watched the two people she loved most in the world with a heart overflowing with quiet, complete happiness. Whatever challenges the future might yet hold, she understood now with absolute certainty that she and Sebastian would face them exactly as they had faced everything before, together, honestly, and with a love strong enough to overcome any obstacle placed in their path. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy her had, in the end, led her instead toward the greatest happiness she had ever known, proof, perhaps, that even the cruelest beginnings could ultimately give way to the most genuine and lasting love, if only two people remained willing to face the journey together with honesty, patience, and an unshakable commitment to one another. 5 years passed at Havenwood, each one layering fresh happiness over the foundation Alina and Sebastian had built together during that first extraordinary year of their marriage. The estate had grown livelier with the years, filled now with the sound of small running feet, and delighted laughter echoing through corridors that had once felt so quiet and unfamiliar to Alina when she first arrived as a nervous young bride. Charlotte had grown into a bright, curious child, her dark curls and quick wit drawing frequent comparisons to her father, while her warm, generous nature reminded everyone who knew her of Alina's own gentle spirit. She had been joined 2 years later by a younger brother, a sturdy, cheerful boy named Henry, who followed his older sister everywhere with fierce devotion, determined to keep pace with her endless adventures throughout the estate gardens and surrounding woodland. Alina often found herself watching her children play together near the same garden paths where she and Sebastian had first begun to fall in love, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that terrifying night at the ball so many years earlier. The frightened young woman who had once stood humiliated before an entire ballroom now moved through her days with quiet confidence, secure in her position, her marriage, and the genuine happiness she had built alongside her husband. Sebastian, too, had softened considerably over the years, the careful reserve he had once maintained so rigidly in public settings gradually giving way to open warmth, particularly whenever his children were near. The tenant families who had once known him only as a fair but distant landlord now regularly witnessed their Duke laughing freely as Charlotte chased Henry across the estate lawns, or kneeling patiently in the dirt beside his son to examine some fascinating insect discovered during their explorations. It was during a particularly bright spring afternoon, as Alina sat on the garden terrace watching her children play nearby, that Lady Winslow arrived for an unexpected visit, her expression carrying a mixture of amusement and genuine news. "You will never guess who I encountered in London last week," Lady Winslow announced, settling into a chair beside Alina with barely contained excitement. "Constance Fairweather, though she goes now by an entirely different name. It seems she married a quiet country clergyman some years back and has, by all accounts, become quite devoted to charitable works within her local parish." Alina felt genuine surprise at this news, though not entirely displeasure. "I am glad to hear she found some measure of peace," she said honestly. "Whatever cruelty she once showed me, I have long since released any lingering resentment toward her. We were both, in our own ways, shaped by circumstances neither of us fully controlled." "You are far more generous than I would be in your position," Lady Winslow said, shaking her head with fond exasperation. Though I suppose that generosity of spirit is precisely why Sebastian adores you so completely. Elinor smiled, glancing toward the garden where Sebastian had joined the children, currently engaged in an enthusiastic game that involved considerable running and laughter from all three participants. We have both learned a great deal about forgiveness these past years, she said quietly. Holding onto old resentments serves little purpose when there is so much genuine happiness to focus on instead. Their conversation was interrupted shortly afterward by Charlotte, who came racing across the lawn toward them, her cheeks flushed with excitement and exertion. "Mama, Mama, come see what Papa found for us," she called out, tugging insistently at Elinor's hand. Elinor allowed herself to be pulled toward the garden, laughing as Henry joined them, equally eager to share whatever discovery had captured his older sister's attention. Sebastian stood near the garden's edge, holding a small wooden box he had apparently retrieved from somewhere within the estate's extensive grounds. "I found this in the old garden shed," he explained, opening the box carefully to reveal a small collection of pressed flowers, carefully preserved between sheets of delicate paper. "These belonged to my mother, apparently, collected many years ago before her passing. I had not known such a thing existed until Charlotte discovered the shed's old contents this morning during her exploring." Elinor examined the delicate, faded blooms with quiet fascination, understanding immediately the significance of such a discovery for a man who had lost his mother so young and remembered so little of her presence in his childhood. "This is a beautiful find," she said softly, watching Sebastian's expression carefully. "I thought," Sebastian said, his voice carrying unusual tenderness, "that perhaps Charlotte and Henry might enjoy learning about their grandmother through such small remnants of her life. I know so little about her myself, yet these flowers suggest a woman who found genuine joy in simple, beautiful things." Charlotte peered curiously into the box, her young face thoughtful. "Was Grandmother Ashford kind, Papa?" "I believe she was, from what little I remember and what the older servants have told me over the years," Sebastian answered gently. "I wish I had known her better myself." Elinor watched this quiet, tender exchange between father and daughter with a full heart, recognizing how far Sebastian had traveled from the guarded, careful man she had first married. Where he had once spoken so briefly and reluctantly about his childhood and his distant relationship with his own parents, he now shared such memories openly with his children, determined that they should know as much as possible about the family history that had shaped them, even the difficult and painful parts. That evening, after the children had finally been settled into their beds following considerable protest and several requested stories, Elinor and Sebastian retired to their favorite spot in the library, the fire crackling softly as darkness settled fully over the estate grounds outside. "You have become a wonderful father," Elinor said, settling comfortably beside him on the familiar window seat where they had spent so many quiet evenings together over the years. "Far different from the father you described to me all those years ago." "I am determined that Charlotte and Henry should know a childhood filled with warmth," Sebastian said, "the kind I never fully experienced myself. Whatever mistakes I make along the way, I hope they always know without doubt that they are deeply loved." "They do know it," Elinor assured him. "Anyone who watches you with them can see it plainly." Sebastian reached over, taking her hand gently in his own, the familiar gesture carrying the same warmth it had held since those early, uncertain days of their marriage, though now deepened considerably by years of shared experience, shared joy, and shared hardship overcome together. "I think often," he said quietly, "of that night at the ball, watching you standing alone against such cruelty. I did not know then what that single impulsive choice would eventually bring us. A marriage, children, a life together far richer and more meaningful than I had ever dared imagine for myself." "Nor did I," Elinor admitted. "I remember feeling only fear and anger that night, certain my life had been irrevocably ruined by scandal and gossip. I never imagined that same terrible evening would eventually lead me toward this life, toward you, toward everything I now hold most dear." "Do you have any regrets?" Sebastian asked softly. looking back on everything that brought us together, the danger we faced, the uncertainty of those early months. Alina considered the question seriously before answering, though her answer, when it came, arrived without hesitation. "None whatsoever," she said firmly. "Every difficulty we faced together only strengthened what exists between us now. I would not trade a single moment of our journey, however frightening or uncertain it once seemed. For I understand now that each challenge brought us closer to exactly this life, exactly this happiness, exactly this love that has grown so much deeper than either of us could have predicted when we first exchanged our vows." Sebastian drew her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead as the fire continued its quiet crackling beside them, the estate settling into peaceful nighttime stillness around them. "Then I too have no regrets," he said softly. "Only gratitude for the remarkable path that led us here together, exactly where we were always meant to be." Outside their window, stars scattered brightly across the clear night sky above Havenwood, the same estate that had once felt so foreign and daunting to a frightened young bride, now standing as the beloved center of a genuinely happy family, built from scandal and honor, danger and devotion, and ultimately, a love strong enough to overcome every obstacle placed before it. Alina rested peacefully against her husband's shoulder, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, she and Sebastian would face them exactly as they always had, together, honestly, and bound by a love that had proven, time and again, more resilient and more genuine than either of them had ever dared to hope for when their extraordinary story first began.